You have a pen? Do you have a pen? Oh, thanks. In case you need a pen.
Yeah, but she gives a balance of both.
I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to our Thursday conference. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, who, for those who are DMICE old-timers, know Sarah well because she actually previously worked for the program. She's currently Assistant Director of the OHSU Teaching and Learning Center, so they're the folks that run Sakai, our learning management system. And in a prior life, when she wasn't at such a high esteemed position, she was the mere DMICE Sakai person, and so many of us worked with her for quite a bit as we used Sakai to put our courses online, either our on-campus courses or online courses. And so Sarah's going to speak to us today about active learning. Some of you may question, why are we having a talk on teaching? And, well, one reason why is because she volunteered to do it. But I actually think this is actually important because probably all of you who are who are fellows, so who are PhD students or postdocs, will probably do some amount of teaching. Even if you end up in industry, certainly if you end up in academia. So it's important to be exposed to learning concepts, and what we're going to hear about today is active learning, and I guess Sarah would be remiss if she hasn't already planned out our active learning activities. And I actually have to say I try to make use of active learning in the teaching that I do. Obviously, if you're in an online asynchronous situation, that's a little more challenging, but certainly in person as a way to engage the audience and not just lecture at them for the entire time. So anyways, Sarah earned her Master's of Education from Portland State in 2009 and has worked in various roles at OHSU since then as an instructional designer, active learning coach, and has also trained faculty to help write good multiple choice questions, which on the clinical side these days is an important thing. So she's going to present to us today her talk entitled Keep It Active, Strategies to Foster Active Learning in the Classroom.
Thank you, Bill, for that very flattering introduction. So as Bill mentioned, I'm Sarah Jacobs, and I actually was an instructional designer with the DMICE program for 5 years. So I'm very familiar with the content. I would not say I could earn a master's or PhD in anything in informatics, but at least I kind of have a little bit of the vocabulary. So we're passing around a sign-in sheet, and I've also left some workshop evaluation sheets on the ends of each table, which we'll come to hopefully at the end. Please don't fill those out till the end. Unless you really want to, that's okay. You will find probably that I'm sort of weird and energetic, so just kind of go with it, and hopefully it's okay. So today we're going to talk about active learning, and not only is this important in teaching, but it's also important in presenting. So everyone probably in this room is going to do a presentation, even if you don't do some sort of formal teaching. So this active learning applies to all learners, whether it's formal or informal, whether you're speaking to the public or you're just teaching a class. And so today we're going to talk about some main concerns you may have with active learning. Can I pass it along? Okay. And also we'll talk about, hopefully, I'll give you some ideas about how active learning can improve teaching or improve instruction. And you should be able to identify at least 2 ways. And then we're going to talk about how active learning can improve knowledge retention and learner satisfaction with any presentation that you give. And hopefully you'll choose a strategy you'd be willing to try in your next presentation and identify that strategy and discuss with your peers kind of how you might address some of those concerns. So first of all, now this is truly active. I'm going to have you write something on these brightly colored sticky notes and get up and stick them on the board up there. So basically what you're going to do, I wish I had worn pants so I could attach this to my something. What you're going to do is you're going to identify any barriers, concerns, or fears you have about active learning. You're going to stick them on that whiteboard up there. And I will be passing out sticky notes. Thank you. I'll give you some more just in case. And that food smells really good.
I'm sorry.
Oh, however many fears you have.
Spiders.
Maybe just keep it to active learning fears. Or concerns.
Spiders will attack you while you're attempting to actively.
Who doesn't have that fear, though? Anyone need any extra sticky notes? Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, what you're going to do is write it on a sticky note, stick it on that board up there. And, oh, I threw it at you, sorry. Hopefully I can erase this. And I guess if anyone's online and watching this while streaming, just kind of think of any barriers or fears you might have to trying active learning in a teaching situation, and maybe write it down because we're going to come back to it.
Can I just clarify that real quick?
Sure.
Here's a barrier for yourself, here's a barrier for others.
Either one.
Oh,
So yeah, if you have any barriers like, oh, my students aren't going to like it, for example, might be one. Not saying you should have that fear, just saying it might be one that you have. Okay, you ready to stick it on the board? It's okay, you can get up. I don't bite. Let me know if you can't get out. Thank you. Oh man, lots of fears. Lots of scared people.
Oh, someone's going to problem.
I'm hoping they are.
All right, share.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, let's see. I'm trying to summarize, but maybe I shouldn't because there are quite a few different ones. But there is a theme of lack of audience comfort, engagement, or students are easily distracted. I assume that's for students, not the teacher, but it could be either way. There's time to develop it, or time to implement, or both? Both, okay, cool. There's a concern about learning styles. Not everyone learns the same way. That's a good one. Public speaking, that's a tough one. I'm not going to cover that today. Oh, welcome. Takes too long. Oh, that's a good one. Won't have time to fit in the content. Cool. There's a sign-in sheet, too, if you catch it somewhere floating around the room. Okay, great. So we have a couple of themes here. Where did I set my clicker? Okay. So we're going to hold that thought, because we'll come back to that. But those are some things I just wanted to kind of, let's sort of exercise our fears, get them out, and then we'll talk about how to address them kind of closer to the end. But one thing I want you to imagine is, how do you think people learn? So if we're looking at, and I apologize, this is not in a 60-minute interval, which is normally how long a teaching session is, like this one. But normally, where do you think learners retain the most knowledge in terms of a 40-minute session? So is it high or low in the beginning, middle, and end of a session? So I just want you to think about that. So this is if, let's say, you give a test either immediately afterwards or 2 weeks later. The information presented at what point during a session that's 40 minutes long will have the highest retention or the lowest retention? Okay, so, oops. So here are some actual responses I've gotten before from people. Which one do you think is correct? Okay, which one's the orange one for those of us colorblind people? Bottom right, okay. Note to self, change that color. Okay, so how many people think bottom right? How many people think a different one or something else? Okay, does anyone want to share what they think the curve might look like? Okay, so the green, okay. The reverse of the yellow, so it starts high and just kind of drops off after there. Okay. Any other thoughts on this? Okay. Oops. Degree of retention. Yeah, sorry, I gave away the answer. Okay, so there's a ton of research out there that shows that this is kind of more of the model of how well people retain information when it's presented during a 40-minute session. Now, Dr. Sousa did a meta-analysis and sort of, I guess, coalesced the information into something he called prime time. So in the first 5-10 minutes is the highest degree of retention throughout an entire presentation. So that's what he called prime time 1, and that's when you want to really present the meat of what you're presenting, or the most difficult concepts. How many of us structure our content that way? Okay, maybe some of us in the know. I don't know about you, but when I used to teach middle school, and actually college isn't that much different than middle school, I used to spend the first couple minutes taking attendance, making sure everyone was comfortable, getting people to sign into the worksheet or to the sign-in sheet. And now I've already wasted my time when the learners are like ready to go and are little sponges or large sponges, whatever. Okay, so then Sousa sort of postulates, which this has all been very well documented that this is what's happening, that it drops off around 20 minutes to the lowest it's ever going to get, and that's called downtime. And then there's a spike at the end. What the psychological reason for that spike is a little unsure. Is it, I was just spacing off, now I have to pay attention and it's almost over, maybe. Or just like, I'm done looking at Facebook now, I'm going to go, or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, I'm going to go back and start paying attention again. Not sure. That's unclear. So what Sousa suggests is do a really succinct intro in that first 5 minutes and then jump right into the hard stuff. And then as attentions begin to taper off, do an activity of some sort where they're actually applying that knowledge. And then make sure during that prime time too, you're doing some sort of closure that summarizes. And hopefully it's a closure activity so that the person where the people are actually doing what they just learned about, or at least practicing a little bit. Are there any questions about that? Yeah. Okay, good question. So the question was, this is for a 40-minute interval, and that's what was studied. In most classes, and I think that's because this was studied in K-12 and then sort of applied later to adult learning, where periods in a high school, for example, are about 40, 45 minutes. But they did a study where they didn't do 60, but they did 120, they did 80, 120, and 180, I think. And what they found was that when you scale it out, you expand the time, all that really happens is prime time 1 and 2 sort of get a little bit longer, but downtime just expands a lot.
I mean, this is common to know for the
Yeah.
decades.
Yeah.
The privacy and decency and fairness.
Exactly.
Event related where it's taught as memory.
That's right.
This is trying to remember literally the event of something that you've seen before without properly encoding.
Cool, thanks. That's a great scientific explanation. Yeah, it is. This is all based on the primacy recency effect. So I don't jump into that usually because some people get kind of bored, but I think it's fascinating. It's what I love talking about. But yes, this is a very distilled, easy to understand way to describe this. So I want to just talk a little bit about closure and wrapping up. I just want you to imagine, if you have a bunch of books on the left or the right, you got to pick them up and take them away with you. This kind of talks about encoding or not. Which bunch of books is easier to pick up, take away, right? It's the one that's wrapped with the old belt strap. So this is why you do a closure. And this is how our brains work. If you have the learner, well, I mean, you could wrap it up yourself by giving a summary of what we just talked about. But ideally, you have the learner summarize what they've learned. And then that encodes it in their memory in a specific chunk that's recallable. So that's why we do a closure. Sort of an aside, a little bit off timing-wise, but I just wanted to mention that in case you weren't sure what a closure is. Usually, you just have the student do something where they wrap up what they've learned in that last hour or 2 hours or 5 hours. Yeah.
And I have a question. I'm also going to use the mic. Just, I don't know how many people are out there listening, but in case people are, maybe people can pick up the mic. I assume these studies are all done on in-person lectures because, you know, another common way of lecturing these days, what we do in this program is people listen asynchronously. They can start it and stop it. Is there any data on that, or is that just too new? Because, I mean, theoretically, if someone gets to a point that, oh, I should have been paying attention there, they can just back it up and listen to it again.
Yeah, there is data on online lectures, too. The best practice really is to chunk it into 10 to 15-minute chunks, even though students can go back in and rewind and rewatch. Just make things kind of in little nuggets of easily digestible information, because that's kind of how our brains work these days with all of the media that we consume. So this is definitely only for in-person presentations. This applies for in-person presentations. Any other questions? Okay, so there are a couple other reasons to do active learning in your classroom besides the big pillar at the bottom. It increases knowledge retention. It also increases student learning performance, so whether they how they learn more effectively. So students learn more effectively when active learning is done. And that's a little bit different than knowledge retention. And also students and teachers report higher satisfaction. I want you to think about when you're presenting a lecture and you're talking for 60 minutes, how exhausting that is. When teachers, even those that don't want to do it, often when they switch it up and they have students doing some of the talking and working together, they report higher satisfaction with their teaching because they are not as exhausted and they really feel like they understand whether the students are getting it or not. And it can also create a sense of learning community, especially in a very large lecture hall, which isn't really the case in many programs here at OHSU. Okay, so now we're going to get back to those fears. So I anticipated what you might say and came up with, we're going to talk about the three kind of major concepts that came up on the board. I've talked to people enough that I know what comes up. I know what they're scared of. I know what the barriers are. So the first one is I can't cover all the content. And several of you wrote that. So that is a serious, that's something that I hear all the time from instructors, from students. If I take time to do active learning, I don't have time to cover this piece of the content. So what I want you to do, and we're going to try an active learning method called the silent Socratic dialogue. So for this particular activity, you have to be partnered up. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you timed individual writing. And basically, you're going to answer the question, why do you feel like you must cover all the content in the presentation? So you're going to have 2 minutes to write what you think the answer might be. And then you're going to swap papers. So let me know if you need some paper. Feel free to use the back of the worksheet if you, or the evaluation if you want to. Make sure you have a partner. So this is a, I know you're all getting organized. This is a silent activity. There's no speaking at all once you've organized yourself. So you're going to write down your response. You're going to swap. And you're going to give each other a genuine question based on what the first person wrote. And then you're going to swap again. And then that person's, you're going to respond to each other's questions. Okay, and I'm going to time you. Let's see. Maybe, well, there's a spelling error on my slide. Maybe just either you can imagine why someone might think that, or you can
Explain why I don't feel that way.
sure, yeah, that works.
All right.
Okay, we'll write about that then. Does anyone not have a partner to swap with? You can do it as threes, but it's, oh, there you go. Okay, so swap. Now you have 1 minute to respond to the person with a question that has to do with what they just wrote.
That's an issue. Do you prioritize or are you planning on teaching?
Oh, we'll talk about it later.
Oh, sorry.
Quiet time now.
You said swap papers for you to ask a genuine question.
Write a genuine question for the person on the paper.
Write a genuine question.
Yeah.
That's ask.
Yeah, so you're writing your question. Okay, so it should be quiet. We should be writing questions to our partners. Oh, she can't read your handwriting. Got it. Okay.
I'm extremely dyslexic. My apologies.
Okay, how many people need a little bit more time to think of a question for their partner? Okay, I'll give you another minute. I'm giving everybody a little minute, another minute on the second step. Okay, if you are ready, swap papers back to the originals. So the person should have their original paper if you're in threes. And you should answer the question. Did you run out of paper? Okay. Okay, how you feeling? Have you had a chance to respond to the question? How many people need a little bit more time? Okay, I'll just give you 10 seconds. Okay, so normally we would have the second person read the response, but I think it's time to debrief because some of you were already starting to talk to each other. So that's a good sign. That means there's some sort of debate or curiosity that was piqued. Okay, so does anyone want to talk about what one of the conversations, the silent conversations that happened? Does anyone have anything they want to share about that? Let me give you a mic.
Curiously, both of the conversations I was involved with.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
This is probably as close as I can get.
Online, so we'll definitely want you to be able to hear. I
Sure.
don't actually know if there's anyone out there.
I'm just worried about my voice.
All right.
So curiously, what came up in both of our conversations in terms of the questions was really about how do you prioritize content and or order content in a way to basically focus on what you need to cover and what the audience needs to know or can know.
Okay, cool. Anyone else want to share something that came up, or even something that was funny or didn't work about the activity? Okay, yeah,
So I would just say that
I think it's off.
I would just say that legible handwriting is important for this activity. / also having a writing utensil. Both of those were issues in my threesome.
Okay, I like that.
So being prepared, I guess, for whatever the active learning activity is could be challenging.
Okay. I do this activity with doctors a lot, so they somehow can read each other's handwriting, but nobody else can read it. Okay. Thanks, Lynn.
So one of our conversations, the like issue of like, if you do run out of time, which is like very plausible and possible, like the idea that then your learners are like spending more time outside of class and like doing learning on their own and maybe not seeing it for the first time on their own, and how like it's usually like more ideal for when someone's seeing, maybe more ideal for someone when they're seeing stuff for the first time to have sort of that like face-to-face capacity to ask questions, etc. But that like there's also the positive that you're like inspiring people to like actually do more learning on their own, and like really that's actually good too. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the concern really is kind of learners are alone when they're experiencing content for the first time. If you run out of time.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else that came up?
I mean, presumably what you're doing in class to communicate that information is an activity that has value. And if your model for dealing with the rest of the content is learn it on your own, you're basically saying that what you're doing in class doesn't have that value or can be ignored for the rest of the content that you're not able to get to in class, which is kind of self-defeating. The other thing that came up in our conversation was how well can you count on your learners to learn things independently, and how well are they supported in terms of what resources they're able to access, how do they know what to learn independently, and how do you kind of keep them on the right track?
Learner preparation. What was the first thing you mentioned? You said devaluing class time is a concern,
Well, you're devaluing. Oh, sorry, thank you.
or disincentivizing attendance.
Not that so much. You are either devaluing the content you don't include in class, or you are devaluing the activity of active learning in class if apparently it's fine that you don't cover half the material and that material is expected to be learned just as well without what you do in class, in which case, what are you doing in class?
Okay. Great.
I found myself wanting to speak and have a conversation with my discussion partner, and so I don't know if there's like a meta agenda here in this activity, but I certainly felt that this format was difficult for exchanging, and it didn't feel very Socratic to me, because I had many more questions than I could write in that little bit of time, and so maybe that underlines the importance of direct interaction instead of learning by writing, but I don't know.
Yeah, so I know, I think Shoshana has come and presented to you about a little bit about learning styles. And this particular activity is better for students who don't like speaking. So that's kind of, there is a little bit of a meta agenda here. And for some people, this is a very engaging way to learn. I personally learn better by just talking a lot. That's why I'm up here presenting, right? But this is a really great way to engage quiet students, which there are a lot of them. So another way, and a lot of you have done this, is by doing online learning. Quiet students tend towards more online learning because of that. But if you're trying to engage students in the classroom, in a live classroom, a face-to-face, this is one method for engaging those students who don't often offer up their opinion. Yeah.
One other advantage on the other end of that extreme is if you have very enthusiastic communicators, or if there's a topic that people are very interested in. I've had many very rewarding conversations. There's benefits on either side, but if you're having a real in-person conversation and everyone is inspired by the first half of your clause to comment on something else, those can occasionally get to very productive places, but it's also good to have a venue where you have to finish the thought that you wanted to communicate and then present it in an orderly way, because sometimes things can veer off a little.
Yeah, true. And actually, this is the abridged version of this. I would say if you do this really successfully and a really deep dive into material and people's opinions or thoughts or feelings about something, you probably want to give it a half an hour. We don't have a half an hour, so I abridged it to about 10, 15 minutes. But that might address some of the issues, and you can have them swap back and forth as many times as you want. And you can give them more time, too, so they can write more questions and respond to more. Okay, so we have a couple of things we probably need to address. Maybe not so much legible handwriting, but maybe in the future, if you use this method, and when I use this method, I will tell people to write legibly because someone's going to read it. But running out of time that's a huge concern, and also there's so much content to cover. How do you prioritize that? That's a huge concern, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later. We're going to go on to the next most common fear, and at the end we'll kind of brainstorm ways, and we'll have a discussion about ways we can address some of these bigger issues. So another one is learners don't like active learning, or they don't like working as a team. And I've heard this one so many times. And actually, if you look at course evaluations at OHSU, people who do active learning get lower marks. Sometimes, not all the time. If they do it well, it's usually pretty good. So that disincentivizes instructors to wanting to try it, right? So how do you address this? So learners don't like to do it. Well, they don't like to do it if it's not well organized. That's really the takeaway. It's not that that learners don't like to learn actively. I'm sure you can tell me that. Yeah.
Well, I think the other aspect we don't talk about enough is psychological safety. Like,
Yes.
you know, if it doesn't,
Absolutely.
if the norm does not feel like it's safe to contribute, then it's going to be very hard to get people to talk. So
Absolutely. Yeah, and I used to observe medical school lectures for a living. I did that for 3 years, so 40 hours a week of teaching observations. What I found was medical students are often very scared to be wrong, and so they won't participate in active learning. So there are methods to kind of addressing that. One is to, I got you, just a minute. One is to make sure that any active learning that's done is anonymous or quiet. Like the silent Socratic dialogues, students tend to feel a little bit more safe. They usually pick a partner they feel safe with. And also using an online polling system where the responses are not assigned to a particular person. That is a really great way to engage people. Also, you really need to talk about safety and establish norms in your classroom. I didn't do that today. It's a safe place, right? But seriously, that's something that you need to address, especially when you're teaching a class by yourself, where you're going to experience the same learners over and over again. Yeah.
Part of that function is actually cultural. So, thank you. Part of that function is actually cultural. It depends on the social network or group of the students that you're referring to.
Yeah.
So in the context of medical students, oftentimes, depending on the program, there's this cultural expectation of competition, which means that if they're learning in a group, that doesn't help one of them to get an advantage. So there's this subconscious priming due to the culture of competition with respect to med students that promotes things like solutions that you're suggesting, such as anonymization.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, dentistry too tends to be very competitive. I don't know about you guys. You seem pretty cool. Not that being competitive isn't cool. Okay, so one way you can do this, so if people are feeling like, oh, I'm so tired of think, pair, share, which I've heard a million times before, because it's really easy to implement, so instructors use it, that particular method. One thing that I've had people do really successfully to promote that community and group work is fill out a graphic organizer. So you either have a blank outline of a lecture, so with maybe slide titles or just main takeaways, and then you have students kind of try and fill out what they're listening to. And then every once in a while you have them kind of work as a table group and compare and make sure that everybody's on the same page. So that's one way to kind of get people talking but not really stress them out, right? It also, Shoshana wanted me to say this, it promotes active studying because you take away a study guide from that actual talk, right? So the learner has a takeaway. So we're going to do kind of a very tiny version of this. I'm going to pass out a handout that has, I think it has 43, but it might have 37, or it might be a completely different number, of active learning strategies. Put it here. Okay. That you can try. And what you're going to do is talk with your table group or with a partner about which one of these you might be willing to try. Oh, sorry. Are there any extras? Okay, I'll find one for you. Are there any extras? As teachers. What are you willing to try? Which strategy would you be willing to implement in your next presentation? And I apologize for those of you who are online because I don't have the handout for you. These are listed in alphabetical order, which is probably not very helpful for you. But may help you find them later. Please just raise your hand, too, if you have any questions about something you see on the sheet. Okay, looks like most of you have read through most of them. Now, feel free, just talk with your neighbor. Which one would you be willing to try as a teacher?
Yeah, it really
I'm just focused on ones I would never do, as opposed to, I just focused on like knocking out the ones I would never do. Flashcard thing. It exceeds it. I thought you're right.
Okay. I see people are starting to get into larger and larger groups and are asking some questions like, how does this one work? So let's draw it back in. Does anyone have a question, first of all, about how one of these methods might work? Something you're curious about that you're not sure how you would do that? Okay, I'm going to put someone on the spot. I heard something about mind mapping and how you would do that in a large classroom. So I've seen this done in medical school, and what they do is they have the students all working on an interactive mind map together while the lecture is happening. So, and they use this thing called Bubble, B-U-B-B-L, I think. It's online, and so they're all kind of making their own mind maps. Now this, I know Shoshana probably talked about mind mapping. For some people, this is like, ugh, I don't want to do that at all. That's me. And for some people who are very graphically organized, this is like their dream activity, right? So all you really have to do as an instructor to set that up is give them a platform to do it or kind of show them what they need to do. Any other questions about any of these methods?
We were talking about like some of the methods kind of single people out, and like methods where students are kind of evaluating each other is kind of, I think it can be very, kind of encourage the wrong kind of environment sometimes.
Where everyone's kind of being critical of each other?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, you have to be careful that you're not doing all these kinds of activities. Yeah.
I'm gonna push back a little bit on that. I think it really depends on what you're teaching, the audience,
Sure.
the nature of it. So Catherine and I were talking about her course where she's teaching students how to do review. And so having students review a paper there is teaching them how to do something that they're
Sure.
going to have to do later on. And so in those contexts, that type of learning is actually incredibly useful.
Yeah.
Yes, but that's in the context of it's usually in the context of a paper that someone hasn't written, Catherine, right? Or is it? Oh, it's a draft paper.
Yours is on campus.
Okay, so
But all of this going
draft
back to the
paper
primary.
reviewed by one student, not by the entire class. So nobody's going to feel picked on by 1,000 people, right?
No.
Well, there aren't 1,000
Sorry.
people in the class either.
But mine's supposed to mimic the actual peer review process if you're submitting a biomedical journal manuscript.
Okay, perfect, yeah.
The broader point I was trying to make is that it really depends on what you're doing, your audience,
Yeah.
more than anything else. The
Yeah.
network of that audience. How is that audience actually formed as a cohesive group? And what are the roles that individuals are playing within that group, and how you can leverage that in order for people to teach themselves?
Yeah, yeah. You really need to know your learners and the content really well to pick the right activity. For example, you would not want to do a audience polling question on something that has to do with ethics, right? That's just like, and I've seen that happen before. I'm like, wow, you could really make a case for a lot of these answers. So maybe that's more of a discussion question, or you could do it as a silent Socratic dialogue, because those tend to work better for the kind of like softer, I don't know, whatever, not soft sciences, but the more feelings, affective kind of learning that happens in school. And also, like, for example, to go back to the MD students, they are required to present and defend their cases in front of a team. So for them, they're used to being criticized constantly. And so that activity might work. But it doesn't work with everybody, and you really need to be sensitive to what you're teaching in the audience. That's a really great point. Thank you. Anyone else be willing to share something they'd be willing to try? Like one of the activities that maybe that you've never heard of, but sounds interesting.
I think we were kind of talking about, we really liked the muddiest point, because it seemed like it wouldn't take up too much time, but it would kind of get to understanding what maybe needs to be reviewed the most for students, and like maybe you can't answer the most confusing point for every single student, but maybe just find see if there's a theme going on, and see if you can try to figure out like where to put more time.
Yeah, yeah, good, okay. Yeah, I use muddiest point a lot because it's easy and it doesn't take very much time. And hey, I'm doing some active learning. Woohoo, 1 minute. Okay. Anybody else want to share?
The 1 minute paper is interesting, although some of the lectures we give are sort of complex, they build on things, so I guess you would have to kind of pick the appropriate time, and then some of the ideas are, complex and not amenable to just putting into a simple paper. That there might be more need to develop some detail.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, you have to be careful where you use each. Especially the minute paper too. I've seen people do it as kind of a, hey, what are the main takeaways from today's talk? Get a minute to write it down. I think that's a really good way to use it.
It's a great way to challenge if somebody has an upcoming, this is actually better often in high school where you have AP exams, where somebody has an upcoming timed written exam. So for example, for American history, forcing students to write 1 minute papers after every class will net them better scores on their AP in the long run, on the order of most people getting 3s to 5s.
Cool. I've never heard of that example. That's very interesting. Okay. So the last one we're just going to cover quickly because I want to start getting back to some of the barriers and the questions that came up. So another one was, I don't have enough time to prepare, or I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm just going to answer that one really quickly. We're not going to really talk about it, but I would suggest to look at the activities on the sheet that are marked with a 1 or a 2. Those are very easy to do, and then Google the name of it. You'll find instructions on how to do it. I hear a lot, I don't have time in my talk. That came up before. I don't have time to cover all the content. I don't have time to do active learning and cover everything that I want. So it goes back to that prioritizing content. So what are your thoughts on that? How do you prioritize content? Okay, so does it contribute to your narrative?
I talk too much anyways as it is, but sorry about that. I normally adopt a couple of different heuristics. First of all, it depends on the audience. So I think about first, what is the audience capable of learning? Because often, especially in sciences, we're dealing with topics that are so complicated that we're often coming from a place where we don't even know where the gaps are.
Yeah.
And so really considering what does the audience actually know, and where do I need to go from there? What are the gaps that allow them to get to a point where they can learn things on their own? That's the point at which they need to know. So by balancing the heuristics between what can the audience know, and what does the audience need to know, you can assemble a quick list of priorities for the content, which can then order your talk or lecture or whatever you're doing, training plan, teaching plan.
Yeah, and I'm just going to put out there the importance of objectives, having objectives for every teaching moment that you do or every talk that you do. You need to think about what's the big picture. What's the big picture of what I want the students to get today? And then really stick to those objectives, which is difficult sometimes, depending on the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, well, some people who are subject to my teaching can decide whether or not they agree with this. But no, it's a challenge because I really, most of the stuff I teach about, I'm pretty interested and passionate about and think it's important as a future informatician to know. But I also recognize, that there's just this huge sheer volume. So one of the things that guides me is how can I present the big picture of, like, why are data standards important, and kind of cover that in a framework, and then presumably they will, if they need to, go fill in the details. So aiming to kind of present the big picture on why this is important and how the different pieces fit together, and then trying to force myself to keep out some of the excessive detail that will probably take too much time anyways.
Yeah. Yeah.
In light of that, I think it's always important to have a payoff. And I think you should show the payoff first. So for example, if you're talking about standards, you should show an example of why this is important. And then you can kind of delve into the other material.
Yeah.
So it kind of the example provides a framework for understanding the topic.
Yeah, and honestly, it's going to engage a learner better anyway if they understand why it's important. There's some sort of, there's kind of a debate about whether you should tell a really engaging story at the beginning of a talk to get your learners intrigued, or if you should really talk about the main takeaways in a sort of dry, objective slide like I did. There's a debate about which one works better, but if you can do both, that's amazing. And good luck with that. Anybody else? How do you think you could prioritize content? And this is something that at the TLC we help instructors with all the time. They come to us and they say, I have 12 credit hours. I have 47 hours of material. How do I cut this? And we can help them with that. And usually it involves rewriting objectives. So what are the objectives from the week, from the course, from the module or the lecture? Anyone have other thoughts?
Well, also, what are the competencies? What do we want people to actually be able to do, other than to have these facts sitting in their brain?
Yeah.
How do we want them to apply them? And thinking about that in terms of prioritizing things.
Yeah. So the way to cut content, one way to cut content is to flip your classroom. Now, there's a lot of problems with flipping a classroom. The biggest one really is that you're actually going to require your students to do 17 times more work than they would have if they had just come to lecture and then done the homework. So you have to be careful with it. But I think I would say you can trust them to cover basic content. But when it comes to more complex things, you really want to make sure you're covering that in class. And I'm not saying you can't lecture. Lecturing is fine. Just don't lecture all the time, right? They need to be doing something with feedback from you. I think that's kind of the takeaway. Yeah.
I don't know if flip is a term that everybody might be familiar with.
Okay. So, sorry about that. Flipping your classroom means you have students watch lectures at home and then they come and do something in class. So they have to come to class prepared and having actually watched the lecture or read the reading or whatever, which is problematic too. Yeah.
I think it's also important to note, whether it be like a flipped classroom or whether you're in class, for like teachers to also have an active voice. Because I don't know like the countless amounts of classes where I've sat in a math class for 2 hours and teachers have a monotone voice and I can't focus
Yeah.
because it's just a bunch of, numbers and letters and I'm just sitting there like, I can't focus because your voice is just so distracting.
Yeah.
So I think that's also very important for like, I don't know if there's such thing as like active teaching.
Yes.
But that also needs, I think teachers need to be aware of that too.
Yeah, and I mean, a few people mentioned presentation skills in general. We didn't talk about those at all today. We talked more about like kind of how people learn, but that's something that I think everyone should do. I had a student once recommend that I take Toastmasters, or I go to Toastmasters. I got a thick skin now, but back then it felt pretty horrible, and I didn't. I'm here today, so I lived, but yeah, I think that we need to be pay attention to how we present. And I think one of the most enlightening experiences for me was to record myself lecturing and then watch it and critique myself. Super awful, but very informative, and I changed my practice. So, yeah, I think you're right. That's a good point. We need to be conscious of how we're speaking and make it interesting too. Math is really hard anyway for a lot of us. Okay, me. But, listening to a monotone for 2 hours, that makes it even harder.
So the best statistics class I ever took was at a community college. And the professor, what she did was she actually started by reviewing the history of something. So like Gauss and like the development of the Gaussian distribution and where that came from, what problem they were interested in, why they tried to solve it, and then actually, how they tease it apart and then develop the math around it, and then we'd apply it. And it was like this really nice, like, from the theory and kind of the history and the narrative, that's really like kind of, you can ground yourself in, you kind of get that,
yeah,
to an actual practical application. And that full kind of walkthrough was really, really valuable.
Yeah. That sounds great. I wish I had taken that statistics class instead of the one I took. Okay, I want to be conscious of our time. It's 12:34. So we're not going to do this think, pair, share. We've already kind of talked about what sessions or what activities we might try. But I just want to highlight the main takeaways. We're in prime time too. Let's do this. Active learning. Hopefully you can you see why active learning can help a learner retain knowledge better, and also the importance of doing a closure. And then we didn't really talk about this, but if you're doing active learning a lot, then you probably don't need to be worrying about prime time 1 and 2. But if you're kind of stuck in the lecture mode, please present new concepts first and difficult concepts right away so that you're getting the most brain capacity of your learners. And then hopefully you learned that active learning can be easy, and I would highly recommend 20-minute chunking of lecture. So we have lots and lots of other trainings you can find online on our O2 page or on our public website, but please evaluate me. Sorry, I know you're going to lose your writing on the back of the paper. Let me know if that's a problem, but leave your evaluations up front here. We use it to improve our offerings and track our impact across campus, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.